Good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Plenty for us to get into this week, but to kick things off, let's recap what happened this week in the markets.
Yeah, if we look at the cattle side of the equation first, cash-fed cattle prices were down more than $3.50 this week, while those feeder cattle sales were steady to $1 lower for the week. On the futures side, the April live cattle futures contract was down more than $4, while the April feeder cattle futures contract closed down nearly $3.50. On the choice box beef price, we were down 75 cents this week, really led by lower rib and brisket values this week in that choice box beef price. On the hog side, barrow and gilt prices were nearly $9 higher this week as cash moved up towards those futures, lofty futures prices of last week. The April lean hog futures contract was down nearly $1 this week. The pork cutout value continued to gain ground, up a little more than $6 for the week. It's interesting now that pork cutout value is actually exceeding year-ago levels to a larger extent than what we see happening on the cattle side, and we have not seen that occur for several weeks in a row.
Scott, as we talk about the cash hog prices specifically, are we still building and growing and have this momentum behind the markets on this optimism about some demand certainty shoring up in China with this whole African swine fever thing? Is that the biggest driver that we're seeing on the cash and really on the future side of things over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I think when you look at what's been happening in that hog complex, certainly as it come from the supply side, because we're going to talk about continued growth in pork production, and it's really the demand side where we've seen some lift. And as we've seen signs that African swine fever in China has been growing in terms of significance on the Chinese pork side of the equation, I think U.S. markets are certainly looking forward to the opportunity to move more product to China. And then that's where we're going to get this on again, off again, if you will, as trade moves on current information. If we get some information that maybe it's not as bad, we'll get prices moving down. If we get more information that the African swine fever outbreak is even worse, we'll continue to see some move higher.
Gosh, and there's really been some pretty big numbers again coming out this week about speculation about just how much damage and how much impact it's having in China and on their hog herd.
Yeah, I sure wish we could feel more comfortable with the estimates that are out there. It's always hard to get a handle on exactly what's happening in China, but we've certainly the last few weeks been in a situation where many expect the effects of African swine fever have been growing within China.
Which is good news, I would say, for us, especially taking a look at yesterday's quarterly hogs and pigs report from the USDA, where basically we're seeing that the expansion in the pork industry isn't over.
Yeah, so it sure looks like the cruise control has stayed on in terms of pork production. When we look at the report, it's really, maybe not too much unexpected in terms of what we got out of yesterday's hogs and pigs report. Total breeding inventory up 2.2%, total market hogs up 2.1%. You look at things like pig crop and the inventory of hogs by weight category. All of those things tell me that we're going to continue to talk about pork production that's going to expand 3 to 4% when we're all done with 2019.
When we take a look at that report, normally I would assume that knowing that sow inventory is up, there was record numbers, I think, in pig crop and some other categories, we would assume that it would push prices lower, but I don't think does it not have that much of an impact because of all of this China elephant in the room concern and the potential for demand there?
Yeah, so I think you've nailed it in terms of what's going on in the markets. We certainly see the China effect outweighing what's been happening on the supply side. So I'd continue to say, if I had a concern, it's about the risk on the downside, because if the Chinese trade or Chinese African swine fever effects become less than what we anticipate, we know we have a lot of supplies of pork to deal with this year. That comes on the heels of what was really good growth in pork production last year. If the supply influence outweighs this potential real positive demand side of the equation, prices could move significantly lower. Just as they moved up very quickly, they can also move down very quickly as well.
As we're talking about risk management, I think it's probably a good thing to talk about planting intentions from the USDA as we're thinking about the input side of things for both beef and cattle production. Those numbers came out this week. Are we surprised to see where the acreage makeup is sitting, at least at this point?
So we did, yeah. So maybe we are a little surprised, and we'll talk about weather in a second. The 92.8 million acres of corn USDA suggested out of today's report would be planted. It's not surprising that corn acres was up as we kind of look longer term. On the soybean side, down to 84.6 million acres of soybeans to be planted this year. I guess as I look at the situation right now, we have a lot of wetness occurring across much of crop country here in the United States. So all else equal, if it stays wet, we likely shift some corn maybe towards soybeans as we go through the growing or through the planting season, I should say. And of course, we all know how devastating the floods have been in some parts of the country as well. Getting in to be able to plant may be difficult to get corn, and it might be difficult to get soybeans in as well. But from a flooding standpoint, it seems to me we're going to probably talk about maybe more soybeans at the end of the day when we get a June 30 acreage report out of USDA, and a little less corn relative to what we see in this prospective plantings report today.
And you brought up the weather concerns. I mean, we have a wet weather in some areas, and there's still a lot of acreage. We've had a couple of folks from Brownfield out on the ground in both Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri this week, and there have been several comments that they're not sure if they're going to get anything into the ground this year.
Yeah, so it certainly looks like we're set up for this to not be a limited time flood activity. We'll just have to see how the rest of the spring unfolds. You know, if we go through several weeks where there's no rain across many parts of crop country, then perhaps we get that kind of acreage in the ground. But that's probably not the most likely scenario at this point in time. And how quickly get floods to the point where folks feel comfortable in planting, I think we have a long ways to go. It's certainly been a devastating last 10 days or so when you look at what's been going on in many parts of the states where we have a lot of bottom ground.
Monthly trade data came out this week. As we take a look at that, kind of a disappointing report to take a look at those numbers from January.
Yeah, so both beef and pork exports out of the United States in January were down relative to a year ago. We're talking about beef exports that were down a little more than 1% relative to a year ago. Pork exports also down roughly 1%. On the pork side, Mexico certainly fell off in terms of trade with us. On the beef side, Hong Kong really sticks out as seems like there's a lot of beef supply sitting in Hong Kong that have had a harder time getting into China over the last several weeks. So it's not the best start from a trade standpoint. And that's especially true when you think about just how positive markets have been because of what's going on with potential trade to China on the pork side. So we'll wait and see whether we bounce back as we look at February and March data as that data becomes available to us.
Scott, as we talk about that export data in general, we know the volumes. Do we get concerned when we start to think about the value of it as well? I think about the pork going into Mexico with tariffs and pork going into China with tariffs as well. And that kind of movement, does that come back into how maybe the ag economy is feeling or like strengthen the feeling about the ag economy as well?
Yeah, so on the pork side, you mentioned value. It's important. So down 9% in value. So we saw a much larger slip in the value than we did in the volume. That's been an ongoing issue on the pork side for a while. On the beef side, we actually continue to see value up 3% in January, even though we were down in volume. Those are, to me, very different markets in terms of just what's been overall demand strength. I'm going to be very curious to watch as this China issue helps us, I think, on the pork side of maybe seeing a jump in value as we start to see some more current trade data in front of us.
USDA also released their long-term projections for production this week. As we take a look, pork production is looking to outpace beef production over the next year. What does that mean for the big picture of both beef and pork here in the U.S.?
Yeah, so you ask a good question. I think when you look at what's been happening in those two industries, number one, you look back over the last 3-4 years or so, and you've seen the pork industry that's really been investing in both the production side of the industry as well as the processing side of the industry. I think they've set themselves up for that growth that makes them exceed beef production as we look ahead. On the beef side, if anything that's happened, we actually lost some slaughter capacity and some feed yard capacity when we were so tight on numbers back in 2014 or so. And so I think that has a lot to do with just how much growth we see happening in front of us. I guess the only maybe silver lining for the beef side is that demand has just been so good generally for the beef side. That might help us grow a little more quickly, but it certainly looks like pork set to exceed beef production when we look at the numbers from USDA.
Scott, we talked a little bit about the flooding situation out in Nebraska, Iowa, and parts of Missouri earlier when we were talking about planting intentions. But we also need to talk about the losses. And we know that initial shock and sadness has kind of hit, and we're in that assessment phase for a lot of places. When we look at those losses, how does that potentially impact long-term markets?
Yeah, so I think, we can start on the cattle side. We know, things, number one, have been serious in a number of these states where we've seen flooding happen. On cattle in particular, we know we've lost cattle and calves as a result of the flooding that's occurred. Unfortunately, I'm afraid, in terms of the effects on national markets, those effects will still be very small. Those that are living that day to day in terms of the flooded impacts, it's just horrendous in terms of what they have to deal with. Yet I think the impacts overall will be fairly small. I've seen some pretty large numbers in terms of cattle death losses. I have a hunch those will continue to be trimmed down somewhat as we get a better count from some of the different states in terms of what's happening. I don't want to downplay just how horrific it has been for those that are living it. But yet I do want to make sure that we at least remind ourselves that the effects nationally, although not zero, will probably be fairly modest in terms of supplies as we look through 2019.
Scott, as we wrap things up this week, we had a question submitted talking really, and we talked a little bit about this as well, about the deterioration in the quality of some of the cattle after this winter. As we take a look in your area specifically, what are some of the things that you're hearing, and how does that ultimately play out in the markets? Because that cattle quality issue seems to be pretty widespread throughout much of cattle country.
Yes, I hear a lot of cows not in that great of shape. I think a couple of things that have been at play, in particular in Missouri. So number one, we know hay prices have been very high. I think you got producers trying to stretch the very last and perhaps the very worst of their hay supplies, trying to get to green grass. So hopefully we will in the next few weeks start to see some growth, at least in the southern part of Missouri, that will help take some pressure off and maybe get those cows in a little better shape than they've been. But number two, I hear a lot of concerns about just how wet the spring's been. A lot of cows that are standing in a lot of mud at this point. And that hasn't been good for the overall health of the herd. So I have a hunch that you take the combination of what was a very dry summer, and then you put in a very wet fall and what's continued to be both cold and snowy and wet as we've gone through 2019 so far. We may end up with a calf crop that's a little smaller than we otherwise would have anticipated as a result of all the weather events that have been occurring.
How much is that hay situation playing out? I know Missouri had it rough during most of last year, and towards the end of the year, you got some rain to help alleviate some of those drought conditions. But I mean, hay prices have been astronomical in tons of areas of cattle country. How does it put more stress on producers going into the start of this year then as well?
So absolutely it does. I think number one, they had to buy a lot more expensive hay than they anticipated trying to get through the winter. But number two, now they're sitting here going, when can I actually get to some green grass? Because if I want to buy some hay, number one, it's going to be probably at record or near record levels, and number two, it's pretty hard to find any hay right now. And so I think you have a lot of folks just trying to get transition to spring. When you realize that a lot of the pastures have not fared very well over the winter and early spring here, it I think makes added concern about just how quickly we get some growth to happen as well.
All right, Scott, that's really it for us this week as we take a look at next week. A pretty quiet week in general. What do we have in store?
Yes, we do get a jobs report next week. I think as we look, we also have some newer domestic demand information out there available out of folks in Kansas State University. So I think we can spend our time talking about domestic demand and what we see happening there for 2019 as well.
And the start of grilling season.
Absolutely. Let's hope for warmer, less rain as we go through next week.
All right, Scott, we will see you next Friday. Have a great weekend.
You do the same, Megan.
To have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning, visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can click subscribe. You can also submit questions and comments there as well. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner on Brownfield.